The opening words this morning are adopted from words written by my colleague Joan Javier Duval. You are beloved and you are welcome here. Whether tears have fallen from your eyes this past week or gleeful laughter has spilled out of your smiling mouth, whether you are feeling brave or broken-hearted, defiant or defeated, fearsome or fearful, you are beloved and you are welcome here. Whether you have untold stories buried deep inside or stories that have been forced beyond the edges of comfort, whether you have made promises or broken promises or are renewing your promises, you are beloved and you are welcome here. Whatever is on your heart, however it is with your soul in this moment, in the space of welcome and acceptance, commitment and recommitment, covenant and connection, you are beloved and you are welcome here. Come, let us worship together.
This morning is the fourth Sunday of Advent, and we are lighting our candles this morning, and the fourth candle is for love. These words are the end of a poem by Jan Richardson that I love and read often. It's in honor of all of us who come to this morning with broken hearts of some kind or another. Perhaps for now, it can be enough to simply marvel at the mystery of how a heart so broken can go on beating, as if it were made for precisely this, as if it knows the only cure for love is more of it, as if it sees that the heart's sole remedy for breaking is to love still, as if it trusts that its own persistent pulse is the rhythm of a blessing we cannot fathom, but will save us nonetheless. And I think then I welcome you. So welcome, good morning. Good morning to all those who are joining us on Zoom and our small, faithful crowd in the sanctuary. It's really good to be together this morning. And I have a few announcements to share with you as we celebrate this season of many celebrations and holidays. So the winter solstice is coming on Tuesday, and we have an opportunity to honor the solstice this afternoon with our Earth Connections team that has been holding monthly programs to connect us more deeply with the Earth and our ecosystems. And so 4 p.m. outside on the Common, we'll have a brief chilly solstice ritual, but there will be a fire and hot cider, so dress warm and come out and join us. And if you want to do that and get up early on Tuesday, or instead you want to get up early on Tuesday, there's another opportunity on the day itself to gather at Fawn Lake and sing Up the Sunrise with Don LaFrance Linden and others. So also, Christmas Eve is coming, and that will be coming up this week, and we have a variety of ways to honor that day here at First Parish. We will have a brief family-oriented Zoom service at 3:30 featuring our youth choirs who will perform from the sanctuary, and that will be streamed on Zoom. And then we'll have an opportunity to move through our building for those who would love to be in our sacred space on Christmas Eve. We'll have some stations set up in the common room, some music playing in here. You can sit, you can have some meditative space, or you can do some of the short activities in the common room. And at 4:30, we'll gather outside so that we can sing Silent Night together with candles. It looks like the weather will cooperate and that it will be chilly but dry, so stay tuned in case that changes. But if those conditions remain, we will be gathering for Silent Night, 4:30 p.m. outside with our candles. And then our wonderful, beautiful music extravaganza that we know as our later Christmas Eve service will be happening at 8 p.m. You can watch it on Zoom. We'll have choir. Wendy will be sharing a homily. We'll have back bay ringers. It will be a wonderful show. So I hope you will join for whatever portions of that make sense for you. And then the next day after Christmas is a Sunday, and we are not going to have a service that day. We're going to take it off. We're all going to rest. And I think that is a nice thing for the staff and for our very faithful tech volunteers who are giving us so much of their time and energy, and for everyone who makes these services happen. We will take a little break and we will see you again in 2022 after that. So with all that said, will you please join in our unison affirmation, rising as makes sense for you. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. El amor es el espíritu de esta iglesia, y el servicio es su ley. Este es nuestro gran pacto, vivir juntos en paz, buscar la verdad en el amor y ayudarnos los unos a los otros.
I have a story to share with you this week, which is very slightly adapted from the original story by Barbara Marshman, whom John Gibbons reminded me this week was once the DRE at the Fallen Church and was also the mother of Lindy Anderson, who is a longtime member and former administrator here at First Parish. The story is called The Story of Grudgeville. In a land far away, a wise old woman who knew a great deal about people because she traveled from place to place, came to a strange village. In this town, all the people were carrying what seemed to be great bundles on their backs. And the bundles were so heavy that they couldn't look around very well, and they never looked up. Puzzled by this behavior, the wise old woman finally stopped a young fellow to ask, "My good man, I am a stranger here in these parts, but I'm fascinated by these large bundles that you all carry around, but never seem to put down. What is their purpose?" "Oh, these," the young fellow answered very matter-of-factly, "these are our grudges." "My," said the wise old woman, "that's a lot of grudges to have collected at your young age." "Oh, they're not all mine," he said. "Most of them were passed down in my family." The young fellow heaved a very weary sigh. "See that man over there?" he pointed. "I have quite a load of grudges against his family. His great-great-grandfather called mine a horse thief when they were both running to be elected for mayor." The wise woman looked around and shook her head sadly. "You all seem to be so unhappy. Is there no way for you to get rid of all these burdens that you're carrying?" "Well, we've forgotten how," said the young man, shifting his load a little. "You see, at first we were pretty proud of our grudges. Tourists would come from miles around to see us carrying them. But after a few years, Grudgeville became a dreary place, and nobody came, and we have forgotten how to stop it all." "Well, if you really want to get rid of those grudges," said the wise old woman, "I think I know 5 magic words that will do the trick." "You do?" said the young fellow hopefully. "That would be a miracle. I'll go and call the mayor and have the mayor call the people of Grudgeville together." And he went as fast as his grudges would allow him to go. Now you can imagine that the mayor of that town lost no time in calling the people together in the village square. She and the wise old woman stood on a platform where they could still see the people gathered before them, even though they were forced to look down because of the grudges on their back. The people who were on the village square, though, were so bent over by their burdens that many of them could only see the ground beneath their feet. When they all quieted down, the mayor said, "Good people of Grudgeville, a wonderful thing has happened. A very wise stranger has come to town, and she has magic words that can help relieve us of our burdens, help us get rid of these grudges that we have been carrying for generations. How many of you would like that? How many of you would like to straighten up and have your grudges disappear and be able to look at the world in a whole new way? Listen to the words of our wise visitor and do as she tells you." And the wise woman said, "My friends, these are simple words, yet some people find them very hard to say. I think you have the courage to speak them, however. The trick is that you have to say them to each other and really mean them. The first 2 words are, 'I'm sorry.' And the next 3 words are, 'I forgive you.' Can you say those 5 words?" she asked. "Can you say them together?" And there was a long, silent pause, and then a low grumble amongst the townspeople, when first one person and then another began to say the words. And soon they were all saying them to each other, quietly at first, and then louder and louder, and would you believe it? Just like the wise woman had said, those grudges disappeared like magic. What joy there was in town. People were heard saying, "Look how those trees have grown," and "Is that you, Jim? It's so nice to see your face again." There was dancing in the streets that day, and it wasn't long before they changed the name of the town from Grudgeville to Joytown. And that is the story. And this morning, at this time, I would like to invite you to, whether you're here in person or at home watching on Zoom, prepare to take up or give your offering to support the work of this church and the work of this church in this community. This morning, in the spirit of love and joy, let us take up the morning offering.
Our reading this morning is from the Apology of Tertullian, which is from the year 197. And this is apology, not as in I'm sorry, which might have helped the people in Grudgeville, but apology isn't an argument for. We are a body knit together as such by a common religious profession, by unity of discipline and by the bond of a common hope. We meet together as an assembly and congregation, offering up prayer to God as with united force. We pray too for the emperors, for their ministers, and for all in authority, for the welfare of the world, for the prevalence of peace. We assemble to read our sacred writings, and with the sacred words we nourish our faith, we animate our hope, we make our confidence more steadfast. On the monthly day, if he likes, each puts in a small donation, but only if it be his pleasure, and only if he is able, for there is no compulsion, all is voluntary. These gifts are to support and bury poor people, to supply the wants of boys and girls destitute of means and parents, and of old persons confined now to the house, such too as have suffered shipwreck, and if there happen to be any in the mines, or banished to the islands, or shut up in the prisons. It is mainly the deeds of a love so noble that lead many to put a brand upon us. See, they say, how they love one another. See, they say about us, how they are ready even to die for one another.
Thank you, Steve, for that music today. And thank you, Annie, for sharing in worship with me, and to the tech folks for making this happen, and to Sandy, who's going to be our candle lighter later on in the service. And thank you to all of you who are here. Almost 3 weeks ago, on November 30th, there were 2 articles published and passed around on Facebook, and they both caught my eye. And I read them and I shared them, and they were quite different from each other, and they were published in different places, but they were, as it turns out, written by the same person, Melissa Florer Bixler, who's a pastor at a Mennonite church in Raleigh, North Carolina. And they were both, in one way or another, about the state of churches today. The first was titled, "Why Pastors Are Joining the Great Resignation." According to Barna Group, a research firm that studies faith and culture, somewhere around 38% of Protestant senior pastors surveyed have considered leaving ministry over the last year. And among pastors under the age of 45, that number rose to 46%. They have explained why they are leaving, said Flora Bixler. That name is going to give me trouble this whole sermon. Between what she calls the wreckage of Trumpian politics and a never-ending pandemic, our jobs have been reduced, she says, to negotiating skirmishes over mask wearing and vaccination status. Clergy are feeling exhausted and underappreciated. Many are underpaid. And I will just step in here to say that Annie and I have talked about how grateful we are to be with all of you during this pandemic, because we've heard horror stories from some of our colleagues. Meanwhile, congregations are anxious about church growth and asking for new programs and fretting about shrinking budgets. She also named some of what clergy have loved about church work and why so many have stayed for so long until this pandemic hit. What we gain, she said, is the opportunity to help forge communities held by common commitments. We get to nurture generosity, redistribute our money, and create forms of mutual care and aid. We learn to get along with people with whom we disagree. We care out new ways. We figure out new ways for dealing with conflict and repair and restoration. And all that is very satisfying work for clergy people. But all of that has become harder and harder during this time in our country when people are so anxious and so afraid and so deeply divided, and bringing their anxiety and their frustration and their impatience and their anger and their intolerance with them when they come to church. And so clergy all over the country in all denominations are feeling like they just have to give up. So that was her first article, not a light read. The second one, which came out the same day, was provocatively titled, "My Church is a Beautiful Waste of Money." Did you see that one? In it, she reflects on how anxiety about church finances and declining membership over the last couple of decades, exacerbated by this pandemic that we're still in, have led to churches beginning to think of themselves more and more as businesses, nonprofit businesses. There are books and seminars that focus on branding and on nonprofit financial management for clergy and on marketing to appeal to younger demographics. But we're not a nonprofit business, she says, of her church. We're a worshiping community, people who have been drawn together in following Jesus and creating a particular form of life. What we do, she continues, will look like a waste of time and money to the broader order of utilitarianism. We sing together, we share bread, we tell stories, we form people in the church to be very bad at capitalism. They also remind people that their worth is not tied to how much they produce, which is, of course, a very countercultural message these days. And they learn about love, God's love for them, and how they are called to love one another and the world. And they practice loving one another. My church gives money away, she said, but often to lost causes, to places where there aren't receipts, where people don't register as productive or good citizens, quote unquote. I doubt, she says, that we could make a good case to wealthy donors for the reason for our existence. So these two articles, as you can see, were quite different, and it took me a few weeks actually to realize that they were written by the same person. But during those 2 weeks, they got me thinking together about the future of churches and the future of ministry, and about the purpose of church, and why I believe that churches are so important now at this very moment in history, just as membership is declining and ministers are resigning and budgets are shrinking all over the country. What is a church? What is its appeal? What can a church, especially a Unitarian Universalist church, offer that no one else can? Why would someone these days even want to join or support a church like this or any other UU church that I have served? As UUs, we don't have a sacred text or some set of required sacraments that people can only find here, although we do have some pretty awesome principles, but no one needs to join the church to access those. There are lots of people who might identify as Unitarian Universalists who are not members of our congregations. And we marry and bury people all the time who are not members. People wouldn't necessarily think of a UU church if they wanted to learn more about the Bible or about learning to pray. And you can learn to meditate or do yoga or take Tai Chi in any number of settings without having to join or support a local congregation. Sure, we have some interesting talks and sermons and worship services that are a little churchy but not too churchy, that are much to the liking of the people who do attend. But we are certainly learning in the age of Zoom and YouTube that people can attend any church online almost without ever becoming a member, without ever signing a book, and without ever writing a check. Around here, you can even enroll your kid in OWL through some of the town recreation departments. As Melissa Florer-Bixler says of the church she serves, we don't have programs because there are plenty of those at the YMCA and our public library and our community centers. If people want to pay for those services there, they can get them. So is it our social action that defines us as a church? What about joining the struggle for democracy, which is rooted in our fifth principle? Isn't that something that we do? Yes. But while it is an important part of what we stand for, the truth is that there are more impactful ways to fight for democracy than joining a UU church. That is not why we exist. And the same is true in our struggles against climate change and anti-racism and white supremacy and other social justice efforts. You can join Mothers Out Front or Extinction Rebellion, and many of us do, but you can also do that without joining a church. Now, don't get me wrong. All those things are important, and they're all an important part of what we do together: the spiritual practices, the programs, the worship, the social action opportunities. And if you're a member of a church, it's nice to be able to do those things with other people who are also members of your church. But they may not be enough of a reason to join a church these days. They are all important parts of what a church like ours might do, but what is at the core of church? A few years ago, I came across another article about dwindling church attendance, because people, frankly, have been writing these articles for decades now. And at the time that article was written, less than 18% of the US population attended church on any given Sunday. And I suspect that number is even lower now. But what struck me about that article was that the author said that the question for us should not be, how can we get more people to come to church? Instead, the question we need to be asking is, how can a church become indispensable in its community? I have long ago forgotten the name of that article or where it was published or who wrote it, but that question about how we can become indispensable in our communities has really stuck with me. What might you find in a church or any other religious community that would make it indispensable? What can you find in a church or another religious community that it's hard to find somewhere else? I think there are a variety of answers. I would love to hear some of your answers sometime if you've had a chance to reflect on this question. But for me, it always comes back to one simple word, which is love. How we aspire to be together as a community, the quality of our relationships to one another in community. In our reading this morning, Tertullian, who was an early church father, offers a description of what the early church was like approximately 200 years after Jesus' execution by the state. We are a body knit together, he said, by a common religious profession, by unity of discipline, and by the bond of a common hope. We meet together to pray, to read sacred writings, to nourish our faith, to animate our hope, and to confirm good habits. Now that sounds to me like a very good basic definition of what a church is. As apt today for us, for we who are Unitarian Universalists, as it was back then for the early church Christians, although we are a body knit together not by a common profession of faith, but by a covenant. But otherwise, that's very much a description, I think, of basically what we do. But what I most like about Tertullian's description is his conclusion. He says, "It is mainly the deeds of a love so noble that led many to put a brand on us. See, they say, how they love one another." That line has stayed with me through the years, too, and I often think of it when I think about the meaning of church. Where else, outside of our own families, do we have the opportunity to intentionally practice loving one another? I'm sure there are a few examples, but there aren't very many places. When I was a kid attending the Bethesda United Methodist Church in Bethesda, Maryland, there was a song that we used to sing sometimes as teenagers. That's when I remember singing it. I probably learned it first on a youth group trip to repair houses in an impoverished mining community in West Virginia, where we were fed and supported logistically by our fellow Methodists from within that and surrounding communities. And the song was, some of the lyrics were, "We will work with each other, we will work side by side, and will guard each one's dignity and save each one's pride. And they'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. They will know we are Christians by our love." Now, I probably liked that song in part because it had a catchy tune, and it wasn't a traditional hymn, and I was a teenager, and partly because it felt like it reflected what we were doing back then with part of our summer vacation, helping others. But as important, it felt like it reflected who we were as youth and youth advisors together, working together, practicing patience and kindness and restoration and all of those things together, and caring for one another. We don't have that song in our tradition, of course, and although I've tried repeatedly to convince Unitarian Universalists that the language could easily be adapted to fit our needs, the idea has not taken off. Maybe if you hear the tune, you'll like it. But what we do have in many of our churches is the affirmation that we say each week that begins, "Love is the spirit of this church." Every congregation that I've served in my 20 plus years has said some version of this affirmation, although sometimes with some slight variation that confuses me when I move from place to place. But what does it mean to say that love is the spirit of this church? What does that even look like when put into practice? In my sermon from 2 weeks ago, in which I talked about anxiety, I concluded with some words about love. I said that there is an anxious love that only allows us to be loving to those who are like us and to those with whom we agree. And there is a mature love that calls us to love one another, even the stranger, even our enemies. A love that won't allow us to divide ourselves into an us and a them, but which calls us instead to acknowledge whatever our differences are and then do what love does. And I went on to mention that famous passage from 1 Corinthians, which says, "Love is patient and kind, never jealous or boastful, proud or rude, never selfish or quick-tempered. Love doesn't keep a record of wrongs that others do. Love is always supportive and hopeful and trusting. Love doesn't insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful." And I reminded the congregation gathered that day that this is a passage that we hear most often at weddings, but that it was first addressed to members of a church at Corinth. The author of that letter was writing again to remind the people of the church in Corinth to love one another. That was their highest aspiration, that which held them together, and also, apparently, an area where they sometimes fell short, which is completely understandable because love is not always easy, and love and practicing love in community can be quite hard. There are other examples in the Bible, too, of advice given for how to practice loving in community. For instance, there's the passage from Matthew 18. "If another member of the church offends or hurts you, go and tell them and work it out between the two of you. If he listens, you've made a friend. If he won't listen, take 2 or 3 others along, so that the presence of witnesses will keep things honest, and try again. If he still won't listen, tell the church. If he won't listen to the church, you'll have to start over from scratch. Confront him with the need for repentance, and offer again God's forgiving love." That is so not what our culture teaches us about how to be in community. For the most part, what we learn instead is to avoid each other when we're uncomfortable, to talk about people behind their backs, to other them, to call them names, to blame them, to resent them, to carry grudges, and even in extreme cases, to wish ill for the other person. We live in a very ungracious, unforgiving culture where lots of people are carrying grudges, the antithesis of loving community, which is why I think that churches who practice living in the spirit of love are more important than ever today to counter the cultural lessons, to be a counter-cultural presence, to teach another way of being, and to offer to people a place, a setting in which they can practice what it means to love one another, even the stranger, even those we see as enemies, and certainly those with whom we have differences. And I do mean practice because there are muscles here that have to get developed, and over again we will fall short and disappoint ourselves and each other. Last week, Annie talked about forgiveness a little bit, about how being able to forgive ourselves can make space in our lives for joy. Thank you for that. And that reminded me of the story of Grudgeville that I read this morning to you. And that also reminded me of something I once read about a tradition in Christian Orthodox liturgy. Each year, in the Christian Orthodox tradition, there is a Vesper service at the beginning of the Great Lent, which is followed by something called the Rite of Forgiveness. Frederica Matthews Green, who is the wife of an Orthodox priest and a writer, describes it this way. She says, "The congregation will form 2 lines in the nave of the church, facing one another in pairs. One of each pair will ask the other person for forgiveness, putting it in his or her or their own words. 'My sister, forgive me for any way in which I have offended you.' That person then assures the first person of their forgiveness. and then says in return, "And please forgive me," again putting it in their own words. And the two embrace, and each of them then takes a step to the right and faces a new partner. When you get to the end of the line, you have to change sides, change lines. You end up seeing everyone. It takes about an hour or so, she says, in her congregation for every member of the church to ask forgiveness from and offer forgiveness to every other. Children forgive their parents, brothers forgive sisters. Parishioners who have been at odds must look each other in the eye and ask to be forgiven. No one may brush the request aside, saying, "Oh, but you haven't done anything," because you don't know, right? Maybe this person had judgmental thoughts about you. Even when I am aware of no offense, she says, I can always ask people to forgive me for not paying enough attention to them, for ignoring them, for irritating them. We don't always know when we have offended. Ever since having read this, I have been trying to imagine some version of this practice in our churches, our UU churches. And I've been thinking about how valuable it could be to do something like that every year. How valuable and yet how uncomfortable, and how, again, countercultural. About how doing something like that could help us to live better in the spirit of love. Because all too often we do fall short of our aspirations and of our own and one another's expectations, because we too are human. I just want to say in conclusion that many of our colleagues, as I said a little bit earlier, have been put through the ringer during this pandemic. The same day that I read those two articles, I learned of 3 more colleagues, all within 30 miles of Bedford, all in their 4th year of ministry in their current congregations, who've decided to leave mid-year, December or January, right now, potentially leaving their congregations without interim ministers for the rest of this year. And they're doing that, they're taking that unusual step because they are exhausted. For all the reasons that Melissa Flora-Bixler named in the first of her 2 articles on November 30th. Lots of us, our congregations, our ministers, lots of us are falling short of our aspirations to make love the spirit of our churches right now. And no wonder. We are all exhausted. We are all having a hard time. We are, many of us, less patient and more irritable than ever before. My new theory of interim ministry practice during a pandemic is that the most important thing we can do is simply to help each other survive it. Simply get through it. No new fancy programs or projects, just focus on the stuff that helps us practice loving one another. Like small group ministries, for instance, or holiday memory teas like the wonderful one that the lay pastoral team put together yesterday. Let's just practice loving one another more intentionally in the time of COVID. That looks like practicing being more kind and more gracious and more forgiving and more patient with one another and with your lay leaders and with your fellow committee members and with your staff. Let's practice resisting the quickening of our tempers. Let's practice keeping a record, let's resist keeping a record of wrongs that others do to us. Let's practice taking our concerns to one another directly. Let's practice supporting one another and trusting one another. Let's do whatever we can to resist being irritable and resentful of one another. Let's practice sharing our appreciation freely and abundantly with one another, because these practices will help us survive this thing together. And who knows, maybe people around town will start talking about that church on the common. See, they'll say, how they love each other. and maybe they'll want to check you out, and maybe they'll want to apply for your ministry position. Finally, really finally, I'll just add this. Henry James once said, there are 3 things in human life that are important. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. And the third is to be kind. So may it be here in Bedford. So may we live, and so may we love. And now these closing words from my late colleague, Fred Gillis. May the love that overcomes all differences, that heals all wounds, that puts to flight all fears, that reconciles all who are separated, be in us and among us, now and always. Go in love and peace, and return in love and peace. Amen, and blessed be.